Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 33 of Humanity Rising. Every day since the 22nd of May between 5 and 7 o'clock p.m. Central European Time, Humanity Rising has been convening on Zoom and live streamed through our Facebook page and Awake TV and about a half a dozen other partnering organizations to we guess about 10 to 15,000 people a day as an opportunity as the pandemic unfolds around us, and most of us are still under some form of lockdown and engaging in social distancing, how we could just simply come together and share our experiences, share our solutions that we're trying to implement, and take counsel together as to how we can more effectively shape the post-pandemic world in a way that's more sustainable and resilient and abundant and in alignment with natural systems. We've been talking about a range of issues. We've had people from literally all over the world. We are today focusing on global solutions within the context of global challenges. First, we're going to look at the issue of infectious diseases with psychiatrist Robert Bransfield from New York, and then from Richard Horowitz, a clinician. Both of them have deep scientific background on the pandemic and the microbes and that we're confronted with within the context of climate change. Then we're going to be hearing from Daniel Pinchbeck and Margaret Solomon on the larger complexities of climate change and how we can understand them more deeply and work to solve them. And then finally, we're going to turn to the continent of Africa and hear from Mouctar, who is the director of the Brussels Africa Hub, on how Africa is seeking to rejuvenate itself through what we're going through and the need, in his view, of how we can start to reform some of the international institutions, in particular the World Trade Organization. So the subjects today are very, I would say, encompassing and far-ranging, but they all knit together because all these issues are happening in our world today. So I think we'll just commence forthwith, and I'd like to invite Robert Bransfield, the psychiatrist from New York, to take the floor. And then, as we've always done after the presentations, we'll have a discussion. So if you have any questions or comments that any of the viewers want to make in the chats or in the Q&A, you'll find that at the bottom of your screen. Robert, welcome to Humanity Rising.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for inviting me. I'll give a little background here that I'm a psychiatrist, been a psychiatrist for 45 years. And for about the past 30 years, I specialize in treating treatment-resistant psychiatric illnesses. And many of these people ended up having infectious diseases, and that's why they were treatment resistant. So for about the past 30 years, I've worked with a lot of mental illnesses caused by infections, and I've focused a lot in that area. And many were tick-borne, vector-borne diseases, such as Lyme disease, but other things as well. And overall, in working with these patients, and in my research I've done, I've seen that many infections cause mental illnesses, cognitive impairments, developmental disabilities, autism, suicide, aggressiveness, violence, substance abuse. So I want to touch on two major areas. One area is looking at how we approach this pandemic, and the second area is looking at the link between infections and mental impairments and our possible strategies that we can take. So one issue is, why are we having this pandemic? And one possible explanation is when there's a rapidly changing environment, or the parasites thrive because they can adapt more quickly. And when there's a degraded environment, you see more pathogens. And there's many examples of that throughout history. And also globalization contributes to spreading microbes to susceptible individuals that never been exposed to them. And the third area is gain of function research, where it's just because we can do certain technologies may not mean that we should. Now, this current pandemic gives us a unique opportunity in that this is a unique time when the whole world has a common enemy, which doesn't happen very often, but that's happening right now. So that gives us an opportunity to work together in a cooperative way with people that wouldn't normally work together. But we also have competing interests that may interfere with that. So what path would we take? Would we work together, or would our competing interests get the best of us? Now, the COVID-19 has made us look at how does the world deal with a new emerging disease? And we've dealt with this with Lyme disease for quite a number of years. And what we found from Lyme disease can be applied to what we're seeing with COVID. And we see that healthcare policies can often fail with emerging diseases. Disease statistics, antibody testing, and case definitions can be inaccurate and misleading. Many disease diagnostic and treatment guidelines are flawed. Some peer review articles in prestigious journals can be quite fraudulent. There can be flaws in randomized controlled trials, which are seen with many people as the gold standard, but it can be a fool's gold standard. We can see politicians making catastrophic mistakes that are fatal and harm patients in healthcare policy. We can see that money, politics, and corruption in science and medicine are problems. There are many inaccuracies in the media. But we can also see from what we've learned from Lyme disease that we have solutions. One issue is that we have to listen to our patients. We learn the most from our patients, and the community doctors on the front line who really deal with this. They know more than the bureaucrats. We have to give great consideration to clinical judgment of frontline physicians. And we have to recognize that these chronic relapsing infections occur and can be recognized. And we can't hold the world in suspended animation waiting for a vaccine to be developed, if it ever is developed. I hope it is, but who knows? So the other area I want to touch on is what causes mental illness. Now, we had old theories that we looked more at developmental demon possession, it's your mother's fault. But in reality, there's this genetic vulnerability. And then there's a environmental trigger. And what are the environmental triggers? Now, we have to look at ourselves in an ecological way, that we're part of an ecosystem. And there's an ecosystem outside us and within us. There's the microbiome within us. 90% of our cells are microbial cells that we depend on. And we depend on our environment. We depend on microbes in our environment. And sometimes we have a good relationship, sometimes we have a bad relationship. And we have to think, how do we fit in to our environments? What's our greatest threat? Our greatest threat sometimes could be our own species, but it could be other species. What species are the most dangerous? Is it lions and tigers and bears and white sharks, or is it the microbe? Actually, the microbe is more hazardous to us, but it also is something we depend on. So it's this balancing act. So we have to think of an ecological model. And when we look at examples, for instance, I use the example of World War I. World War I was catastrophic, and it was a very catastrophic environment with the trench warfare. There was a lot of disease, typhus, tuberculosis, encephalitis lethargica, pandemic in 1918. And that's not new in history, because throughout history, whenever there's been war, there's compromised environment, it creates pathogens, and these pathogens and infectious diseases kill more than bullets. Now, the other part of it was all the damage done to people with neurological damage then gave us a whole generation of neurological impaired, many millions of neurologically impaired individuals that may have laid the foundation for World War II. And there's this vicious cycle that we sometimes see. And this is described sometimes as the Flynn effect. And what was done there was they looked at different countries, and the countries that had the highest infection load had had the lowest IQ, the higher amount of mental impairments, and a lower level of functioning. So when we clean up the environment, we have higher level of functioning, greater productivity, and less psychiatric illness. So even though war zones are examples, we see the same thing with pandemics. And one could wonder that this pandemic may give us a decades of maybe mental impairments in individuals that recovered but ended up with neurological impairments. We can also see an interesting issue with leaders. And there are many leaders, for instance, had syphilis, or we could question Hitler may have had encephalitis lethargica. That may have been why he had the Parkinson's. And then you can see a leader that gets mentally impaired and may act in a more psychopathic or erratic way. And how does that affect the world? And we have these, we have to be attentive to how infections cause these mental impairments, violence, and what would give us stability. So stability is more associated with health, education, and economic opportunity, and also democratic governmental structures. So if we can strive towards that, they all feed together. Now, there's some zones in the world where there's a cycle of perpetuation of poor environment, and it goes with developmental disabilities, infections that have neurological and psychiatric consequences, and this repetitive cycle of violence. We see that in areas of the Middle East. We see that in areas of Africa. And when we can clean up that environment, that's all the cycle. In many ways, understanding that and cleaning up that cycle of infections and mental impairments and violence may do more than military intervention. So that gives us great opportunities of how we can proceed to get more stability when we use this ecological approach. And we also have to be responsible with new technology, whether it's the microbe where we can splice and create pathogens, but that doesn't mean we should, even though we can, just like we can split the atom and we can have this atomic energy. So we all share on the same planet, and we all travel together on it. And we can't be isolated from damage in distant locations. That's one thing that this pandemic has shown us. Now, with the work that I've got done with patients who have these infections that then cause mental illness, it does show us that there's great opportunity for treatment and improvement that otherwise we would ignore. And we have to be attentive to that. So we have to connect the dots, but that means a lot of people working together who would not normally work together. So to really be effective, we need psychiatrists, psychologists, we need ecologists, we need people that, biochemists, we need everybody to work together instead of what we might call silo mentality, where I just work in my field and I don't connect the dots with people who work in other areas that are outside of me. So I'm glad you're having this program. It really is a good effort. I've always liked to use a systems approach, looking at things and looking at all the ways that things are connected. And that's the only way I think that we're going to go forward. And we do live in a global community, and we have to protect the global environment and realize one facet of that is when the environment is compromised, then we have these higher incidence of mental disorders, which have less productivity. And when you have less productivity, you have more risk, and also the risk of aggression when there's different kinds of mental impairments. People are more prone to act in an aggressive way instead of in a productive way. So that's basically the point I would like to make, and maybe you could go on and I can make further comments later when we wrap things up.
Ooh, thank you so much, Robert. That's actually quite a profound observation that, you know, the way we treat each other and the way we're treating our own illnesses has a larger symbiotic both effect and is caused in the larger ecosystem. I'd like to circle back to that point when we go into the discussion. But I'll turn it over now to Richard Horowitz, who will speak a little bit more. He's a clinician also in New York City. He and Robert are colleagues for many years on various matters, and he's going to talk about climate change and the virus from another vantage point. Richard?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you today about a subject I don't usually talk about, which is the climate and how it relates to infections. And the title of my talk today for you will be Saving the World in roughly approximately 12 minutes. So I'm going to paint a picture of where the world is heading if we don't shift gears.
More resilient to future challenges. We invite you to join this conversation.
Richard, I think there was some kind of problem with the line. If you would unmute yourself, you unmuted. Just start from the top. I think we're good now. Sorry for this.
Okay, very good. Good. So everyone, thank you, no problem. My name is Dr. Richard Horowitz, and the talk I'll be giving to you today is I've entitled Saving the World in Roughly 12 Minutes. I'm going to paint a dire picture of where the world is heading if we don't shift gears. And I know some of you are listening, and I don't think people realize actually how bad the situation is out there. And I'm not just talking about the pandemic. In the next 12 minutes, I'm going to share with you warnings from world scientists of where the world is heading. I've been following this very carefully over the last several years. And where we're going to go without radical change. And it's not a pretty picture. But the good news is I've been researching solutions now for the past several years, and I'd like to present these to you in a three-part plan this morning. So with our present climate emergency, I think many of you know that scientists have determined we're in the beginning stages of what they're calling the sixth extinction. And that by the year 2040 to 2050, at least 25 to 33% of all of Earth's species they're expecting may be extinct. And that is including our bees, our pollinators, insects, multiple species, fish, from warmer and polluted water, certain mammals. And this excess man-made carbon and methane pollution is now causing a melting of the permafrost, which is setting off climate feedback loops that are expected to raise global temperatures by at least 2 degrees centigrade. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they issue serial reports every several years. They're often called the gold standard of climate research. And the report that they just put out projects us to hit 4 degrees of warming by the beginning of the next century if we stay the present course. The upper end of the probability curve runs as high as 8 degrees. And the last time the planet was even 4 degrees warmer, the oceans were hundreds of feet higher. Just look at the Dover Cliffs in England. The consequences of just a 2 degree centigrade rise is massive glacial melting in Antarctica, flooding in low-lying areas and destruction of farmland with food shortages, tens of millions of climate refugees being displaced without homes. And the hardest hit are going to be the disadvantaged and poorer nations, some indigenous people, local communities that are dependent on agriculture or coastal livelihoods. But there are also health risks in the IPCC report. Heat-related morbidity and mortality with heat strokes, ozone-related mortality with more respiratory problems, especially in those with asthma and emphysema, an increased risk of vector-borne diseases such as malaria, dengue fever, Lyme and tick-borne diseases, because we're going to see an increase in mosquitoes, ticks, and fleas in both number and geographic range. And then we have a risk of new viral and bacterial diseases as they're released from melting permafrost. And I don't think people realize that in the ice that has been frozen for millions of years, we have viruses and bacteria that humanity has never seen and has absolutely no immunity. So this is going to pose a great problem that I'll hopefully answer later on. There's going to be an increased risk of malnutrition as there will be reductions in food availability and decrease in livestock populations from less feed and available water and less fish in both number and diversity because we're acidifying the ocean where the carbon dioxide has nowhere to go but in the ocean. And finally, clean air and water is going to be at a premium due to droughts, flooding where sewage is entering the groundwater, not to mention the effects of heavy metals, pesticides, PCBs, and plastic pollution on human health. And these are all endocrine disruptors. Now, I know considering the possibility of most of the human race going extinct is extremely difficult. Unless, of course, you're a member of the dodo family, great auk, aardvark, white-nosed bat, Pyrean ibex, stellar sea cow, Tasmanian tiger, Baji white dolphin, dinosaur, or members of the Roman Empire, who all mysteriously disappeared. The fact is we're not psychologically adapted as a culture to consider the possibility of our own extinction. And yet science says it is possible if we don't begin to make radical changes today. So here's the three-part program that I'd like to present to you, my approach to save the world in 12 minutes. The first is transforming the world through proper motivation, which is the crux of the paradigm shift. The second is transforming personal health through addressing what I call the 3 I's: infections, immune dysfunction, and inflammation. And the third is transforming planetary health through transformation of medical, societal, and political systems, as well as energy and economic structures. So in part one, transforming the world through proper motivation, I have been blessed with having enlightened teachers when I did my medical school in Brussels, Belgium. And the essence of the teachings that I received from these teachers is loving kindness and compassion. Love, wanting other people to be happy, and compassion, wanting other people to be free from suffering. Without adopting this basic motivation to want others to be happy and free from suffering, significant change on our planet will be extremely difficult. We all need to become advocates of change and wish to be of benefit by working on our own mind and heart and expanding our day-to-day motivation, where we include all living beings without exception on this planet. In part two, transforming personal health, we know that infections and environmental toxins are driving inflammation, and inflammation is the #1 cause of all chronic disease. Whether we're talking about Lyme disease, MS, ALS, autism, Alzheimer's dementia, or inflammation being an underlying factor in heart attacks, COPD and asthma, rheumatoid arthritis, Parkinson's disease, strokes, diabetes, aging, and cancer. In fact, 86% of our healthcare costs and 70% of our deaths are due to chronic disease. So the paradigm shift that I believe we need to have is to go from a one cause, one disease model to one where multiple sources of inflammation and their downstream effects on health take place. And this is essentially the 16-point MSIDS model that I've been developing during the past 30 years. Now, if we apply this to COVID-19, we have found that decreasing inflammation is helpful. We know that the worst effects of the virus is not the virus entering, but the inflammatory response with macrophage activation syndrome. In 2 articles that I published in the last 3 months with Dr. Phyllis Freeman in the medical literature, we have shown that using high-dose glutathione can help people who have COVID-19 pneumonia, relieving their shortness of breath. And this is done by using 3 supplements: N-acetylcysteine, alpha-lipoic acid, and high-dose glutathione, which blocks a switch inside the nucleus called NF-kappa B. The advantage of using NAC and glutathione for COVID is they both have disulfide bonds. They've been scientifically proven to have antiviral effects. They can attach onto the ACE2 receptors of the cells, potentially slowing down viral entry. And they also can help decrease oxidative stress, decreasing the viral machinery from turning on. And if we look at it this way, we need to find common ways of dealing with novel viruses, because as the permafrost melts, we're going to have new pandemics arise all the time. Finally, for transforming planetary health, there are many different groups working on the problem, from the countries in the Paris Accord to the Center for International Governance, 350.org, Carbon Brief. There are many of them. These groups are looking at a comprehensive approach to global pollution. But the first key is to recognize we have a huge problem. Global leaders must sit down and cooperate, and so much CEOs of major corporations. One example just here in the United States is big oil cannot continue to receive billions in subsidies to pull fossil fuels out of the ground without major investments in clean energy, such as wind, water, and solar. So ethics need to be intimately woven into the solutions. It can no longer just be for profit. A change in economic structure is also required for planetary health. If we look at the way capitalism has now been practiced, where it's profit at all costs, it's wrecking our planet and the health of future generations. It is just not sustainable. The change in economic systems, according to UK economists, is called donut economics. And this is where the health and well-being of the planet and all of its inhabitants must be included in all financial decisions where our ecosphere is considered. So you could consider this democratic animism, where we're now considering all the insects and animals and fish and trees and forests and humans. Everything is now being considered as long as we stay within the ecosphere, again, donut economics. And we have to get a 10-year moratorium for the world to become carbon neutral. At least in the United States, 80% of our energy still comes from fossil fuels. We need a full transition to electric vehicles, as well as increasing other energy efficient forms of transportation with energy efficient buildings. How do we do this? We create millions of high wage jobs through a massive clean infrastructure build out. And even just going back to 2019, we only had about 750,000 Americans working in the renewable energy industry, compared to almost 4 million in China and 1.2 million in Europe. And those numbers have not changed significantly since then. If we were to impose a greenhouse carbon tax on fewer than 3,000 taxpaying entities, specifically corporations and municipal plants, just focusing on those few companies would target 85% of our emissions in the United States, and we could give carbon credits to individuals, families, and corporations below the limit. Now, the essential question on everyone's mind is, if we go green, do we really have enough energy to go around? And there was a physicist at UC Berkeley, Maren Moalam, who tackled this problem and discovered that the total world energy usage, going back to 2015, looking at the amount of coal plus oil plus hydroelectric plus nuclear plus renewable, was 13,000 million ton oil equivalents. This translates, according to the physicists, to 17.3 terawatts of continuous power during the year. And they discovered if we cover an area of the Earth 335 kilometers by 335 kilometers with solar panels, even with moderate efficiencies available today, it would provide more than enough power, actually 17.4 terawatts. And this area is only 43,000 square miles. Where would we do it? Well, one example is the Great Saharan Desert in Africa. Contains 3.6 million square miles. It's primed for solar power because it has more than 12 hours of sun per day. It means only 1.2% of the entire Sahara would be sufficient to cover all the energy needs of the world in solar energy. And there's no way that coal, oil, wind, geothermal, and nuclear can compete with this. And even to become energy independent in the United States, Elon Musk has done calculations. We would only need solar panels in 100 by 100 square miles in a piece of the Arizona, California, or Nevada desert. What would be the cost of doing this? They figured out it's about $5 trillion, a one-time cost at today's prices without any economy of scale. That is less than the bail of the cost out of banks by President Obama in our prior recession, and it's much less than the world governments have now spent on COVID-19. So this cost is rather small compared to other spending. But we need to create an international solar alliance, a plan for world leaders to work together to address these issues. We would need a truce in the United States between our warring political parties, where everyone adopts the motivation to work for the benefit of people, not just the American people, but people worldwide, where we all stop fighting and work together. Other solutions, tree planting campaigns to replace the 3 trillion trees that have been lost in the past 100 years. Harvard physicists have looked at the feasibility of solar reflectors, putting 1 million square miles of oceanic solar reflectors to lower planetary temperatures while we all work on becoming carbon neutral. And finally, to achieve wind, water, and solar for building and industry, Dr. Jacobson and University of Stanford researchers published an article in the journal One Earth, and they have shown ways to transition 143 countries to 100% clean energy. So the solutions are available. We simply need to face facts and the challenges ahead of us with unprecedented global cooperation. And this is the biggest test humanity has ever faced. So that is the 3-part program for saving the world in 12 minutes. The first being proper motivation, love and compassion, integrating the highest spiritual ideals of each culture, so we work for the benefit of all beings on this planet. Secondly, transforming personal health, because we have new challenges of infections, viruses, and toxins that require novel ways of protecting future generations. And third, transforming planetary health. We have the scientific solutions. We only need the political will. We need unprecedented cooperation between countries. It can accomplish this, but up until now, an unhealthy patriarchal system defined by control, domination, and profit at all cost has led us down a path of near destruction. It has been dissociated from the qualities of a healthy matriarchy: love, care, support. So women of the world, mothers of the world, future mothers of the world, you need to know your power because your role is vital if we are to succeed. And it is also vital we adopt 7 qualities of an enlightened society: courage, honesty, humility, wisdom, respect, generosity, and love. If we do this, transformation of the world and of ourselves will take place. So thank you so much for your attention, and blessings to you all.
Wow, Richard, that was tour de force. I've never heard someone provide the whole analysis of the problem and the answer in 12 minutes. But it is so correct. And just one comment on donut economics. I'm here in Amsterdam, and you may know that the city of Amsterdam has embraced donut economics as the model they're going to use to completely revitalize Amsterdam in the post-pandemic world. And so we're in discussion with the mayor's office and with various other people around Holland to use Amsterdam as a model, as one of the great, cosmopolitan cities of the world. It's really taking a serious look. And for those of you who don't know donut economics, it's been developed by a woman named Kate Raworth at Oxford. And it's 2 circles. The circle on the inside is human well-being. Not profit, not trade, not GNP, but how do we create a caring economy so that people prosper and are healthy and are abundant. And then the outer circle is the planetary systems, and very importantly, planetary constraints. One of the principal ones of which is, as Richard just pointed out, is climate change. So whatever Amsterdam does needs to take that constraint into account so that there's essentially 0 carbon emissions. So this interactivity between human well-being and the planetary ecology, creating an economic and ultimately political structure in which human well-being is contained and informed by and alignment with ecological systems, natural systems. That's basically the gist of donut economics. And we believe here at Humanity Rising that it's one of those extraordinary ideas, very simple. If you understand a donut, you'll understand donut economics. Everybody knows we need to work toward human well-being. Everybody knows we have to work within planetary constraints and planetary systems. So thank you, Richard, for bringing that up. We'll be talking a lot more about donut economics as Humanity Rising unfolds. Now I'd like to turn it over to Daniel Pinchbeck and Margaret Solomon. Like Robert and Richard, they came in sort of as a pair. And Daniel, many of you know, is a noted author. His latest book has the intriguing title of How Soon Is Now? And I have a feeling, given the pandemic, many people around the world have come to realize that now is now. And we've got to respond commensurately. So Daniel, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll hear from Margaret.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, that was a very interesting talk. I mean, it's very easy now to sort of toggle between, kind of grief and despair over the financial situation, the ecological situation, excuse me. Right now, we're seeing Siberia, having a record-breaking heat wave. Yeah, we all the ecological indicators are in terrible decline around the planet. How soon is now was my effort to think about it systemically. Really came up with very similar ideas as the last speaker in terms of realization that the current economic model is, we can't continue with this type of extractive capitalism any further. And we need to move into cooperative models. In that book, I kind of looked at it in a structural, systemic way. Buckminster Fuller was a big influence. And the three areas that I kind of identified were the technical infrastructure, areas like energy, industry, waste management, and so on, and the social systems like the political and economic system. Then finally, the area of the collective consciousness, mass consciousness, and that these three areas kind of all work together to create the current paradigm. And as you change one, they all change. So as the last speaker was speaking about, massive solar energy investment in the Sahara is a brilliant idea. And we know that these projects, we kind of need to go, as this event talks about, into a kind of world unity consciousness and break through. It's kind of interesting that we're, as this awareness is becoming more and more clear, we have the worst possible leadership in many of the countries in the world, including the US and Brazil and China and Russia, where we're actually seeing these kind of adolescent sociopaths able to kind of control these dysfunctional, rotten, corrupt, systems. And that's leading to obviously kind of radical, even revolutionary tensions that are beginning to explode, as we're seeing in the US with the Black Lives Matter movement. Another aspect of how soon is now was looking at it from a kind of biological perspective. I was very inspired by a book by Bruce Lipton and Stephen Behrman called Spontaneous Evolution, where they talked about how in evolution, there tends to be a movement over time from competition to cooperation, that immature ecosystems are characterized by competition, aggression, and as ecosystems become mature, they become more cooperative, more intensively interdependent. And we see this even with beings like trees, right, which have been around for many millions of years more than we have, and are very cooperative. They, have many species nesting in them, insects, birds. They create fruit, they allow for mushrooms to sprout on them and so on. So it feels like humanity is in this kind of immature adolescent stage of its development, and we're trapped in this competition paradigm right now. And this is kind of the bifurcation moment, like the critical moment where we either move into a cooperative paradigm or we don't make it evolutionarily. In the book I looked at, for instance, this idea that what's going on with the human species on a collective level, it's almost like we could look at ourselves as a giant global organism that's in an interrelationship with the Earth's ecosystems, symbiotic relationship. And when we think about ourselves as a giant organism, then we can think about how, as with, let's say, a fetus in the womb, there's a development of different specialized functions, of organs, and so on. And in a strange way, what are the organs of this kind of nascent collective human organism? We could say that they're actually, you could say nation states, you could say religions and so on, but perhaps the clearest parallel is actually multinational corporations. So if you have a media company like Facebook or Fox or whatever, it's kind of like the sensory organs of the developing fetus that are taking in the raw data of sense information and turning them into kind of symbols, material that then the whole body reacts to. An energy company is a bit like, the fossil fuel companies are a bit like the blood system, the circulation system. Waste companies are a bit like, let's say, the kidney or the liver that are breaking down toxic material and so on. So you get kind of the analogy. But at the moment, if we go back to millions of years earlier in evolution, there was a time when there was an oxygenic crisis, and many microorganisms disappeared, but others began to figure out how to cooperate and to build more complex structures that ultimately became, the organs in the bodies of mammals and in the human body. So in a way, we can almost think about corporations as these kind of nascent organs in the human body, but at the moment they're locked into this competitive paradigm in terms of the economic structure. So for them to become cooperative would require a fundamental redesign of the economic system. So that's one of the areas that we look at in the book. Most recently, I've been developing a course called Building Our Regenerative Future. And the idea of the course is what I noticed over the last months with the pandemic is that many people that I knew and acquaintances on Facebook seem to be lost in a lot of confusion, a lot of fear, and a lot of anxiety over the future. And I really began to feel that part of the problem is that we do not have a sort of coherent model of what needs to happen and what could happen, what our best potential is. I agree with Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote *Sapiens*, that humanity is very myth dependent. Like, we need to have a story, we need to have a governing narrative or myth of how things can get better. We're always, or as Oscar Wilde wrote in *The Soul of Man Under Socialism*, we're always looking forward to the next utopia. And in some strange ways, we could look at the sort of capitalist, consumerist system as a kind of utopia of material goods and so on, distractions. And we've kind of, as I said, we've reached the limit of that model. So we need something else to aim towards. And this model of a regenerative society, of a regenerative system, is, I think, a really beautiful one, and takes us beyond sustainability, which has as its core this idea that we're going to be sustaining the old system. But we also know that old system really can't be sustained. So we really need to move into a different model. And so this regenerative model, we think, is very powerful. So I'm co-hosting this month-long webinar with Rory Spowers, a really wonderful author and systems thinker. He wrote a book about climate change called Rising Tides. He has a nonprofit called Regeneration.me. And we've essentially taken a number of categories, kind of food, health, community, ecology, culture, and consciousness. And we'll be doing live sessions over the month starting June 29th in each of these areas. And the three kind of focuses of this webinar, one will be to give people a comprehensive understanding of these kind of macro trends that will be shaping everybody's future. And that includes, obviously, what's happening environmentally, what we're learning about the microbiome and soil and so on. And the second will be to give people really practical ideas on what they can do in the short term. As Richard expressed, I thought very well, there's no doubt if humanity is going to survive, we're going to need to move into this new paradigm very quickly. And that's also going to mean that there are lots of new careers. When something like the Green New Deal happens, areas like, biochar, composting, urban gardening, farming, permaculture, all of these areas are going to move from being sort of marginal to being essential. We're going to, we sort of know some of the things that would have to happen. There's a great documentary called The Biggest Little Farm, which looks at, just in 3 to 5 years, how people can take an area of farmland where the topsoil is totally depleted and totally replenish the topsoil and then transform the whole local ecosystem, bringing back all the animals and birds and insects that all kind of work together. So basically, we would need, on a global scale, a movement back to traditional forms of agriculture, organic farming that sequester CO2 back into the soil. That's one of the major tools that we would have to reduce the impact of climate change and the speed of it. And yeah, so just in every area, whether it's, and I have friends who have biochar companies or doing projects, one called Make Soil, where it's about building, soil in urban areas through composting, or using technologies in scalable and exponential ways for regenerative goals. So for instance, Tom Chi, who's a former Google engineer, is creating a system with drones to plant, millions of trees and replant whole forest ecosystems. If we're going to have any shot at, basically our, avoiding mass extinction and our own destruction as a species, we're going to have to move into this regenerative paradigm extremely quickly. And it's going to open up all sorts of new career paths and opportunities for young people. So that's the positive thing. I mean, whether we make it or not as a species is really in question at this point. But we do know the areas that we have to address and how we would have to address them. So yeah, and then so the third part of regenerative, building a regenerative future is actually building that community of people who are, activated, aware of each other, and all focused on this new kind of collaborative goal of replenishing the earth, restoring the balance with nature, bringing down our CO2 radically, and so on. Yeah, I mean, there are many ways in which, I mean, it's not fair to say that the coronavirus was of benefit, because obviously so many people are, have perished from it. And also, well, I'm seeing these notes, it's hard to concentrate, like Catherine's note here. I wouldn't say that we can look at the coronavirus as a benefit. However, it has had some benefits. One is this incredible kind of existential stop to society, where this momentum of this industrial civilization that seems so, inexorable, we now see that we actually can break that, and we can, reduce our activities to the basic essential activities. And we did see, quite a lot of CO2 reduction during the lockdown months. We did see animals returning to different areas, nature kind of replenishing itself and so on. So it gives us a sense of how actually this could happen. But for it to actually happen at the scale that it has to happen would require a unified cooperative initiative of humanity, beyond anything that we've seen at this point. I mean, we know, so for instance, in the United States during the Second World War, there was a sudden shift from, just domestic, peacetime manufacturing to focusing the entire economy on the wartime needs. And they were able to, just a few months, to redirect the whole economy in that direction. We know that we could do something like that for this ecological crisis, but whatever, there's some blockage at the moment in terms of the ideological superstructure, the kind of state of consciousness of the masses, the denial that's large scale, and the belief that the system can perpetuate itself. So to break that would require a movement on the media side also. I mean, we would need the best thing that would happen would be for a bunch of progressive billionaires to buy Fox News maybe and repurpose it, but make it the sort of daily ecological news or something. But barring that, we need sort of new media networks. We need new mythologies, new stories, and that's one of the areas that we're going to cover in Building Our Regenerative Future is culture. What it means to identify as somebody who's creating these new myths, these new stories for the future, and how to maximize your impact, both as a leader, as a storyteller. We'll also look at some of the practical aspects of building communities, land trusts, cooperatives, and so on. And then an area, I mean, my past work, my first book, Breaking Open the Head, was about psychedelic shamanism. So I've written about mysticism and shamanic practices of indigenous cultures. I visited indigenous cultures in the Amazon and West Africa and Gabon and so on, Mexico. I believe that part of this transition to this new paradigm involves kind of a consciousness shift where we kind of re-access mysticism, animism, shamanism, but we now can do that from a kind of scientific perspective. It really does seem more and more to be the case that, you know, the experiments, explorations of 20th and 21st century science support the metaphysical view of kind of Eastern cultures, Vedanta, Buddhism, and so on. This idea that, you know, we thought that consciousness was just, you know, a sort of epiphenomenon that happened through the development of the physical brain. Quantum physicists discovered to their shock that consciousness is more like an underlying fundamental reality. And actually it's consciousness that, you know, causes a wave to collapse into a particle. It actually brings reality into manifestation. And each of us is an aspect or expression of this consciousness, which, you know, we feel is very individual and we feel to be separate, but actually there might be another level where there is only one consciousness, this kind of unified field of consciousness, which we're all picking up on, like the, you know, transmitters from, you know, picking up on a television signal. You know, another issue that I've explored a lot in my work that we'll also explore in this course, Building Our Regenerative Future, has to do with this idea of initiation and looking at the current situation that we're going through from a positive sense as a kind of initiation for modern humanity, a collective planetary initiation into another level of consciousness. And, you know, initiations are in traditional societies the boundary between childhood, you know, adolescence and adulthood, and they're seen, you know, they're generally in traditional societies, they required some direct experience of a visionary state, rather through, you know, visionary plants like ayahuasca or peyote or, you know, Amanita muscaria, or through privations like walkabouts, fastings, vision quests, and so on. And, you know, we've tended to think that these initiations were just these kind of cultural events, but actually a wonderful book by Joseph Chilton Pearce, The Biology of Transcendence, proposes that actually they're much more profound than that, and much more important to our development, that they actually have a neurophysiological function where without going through a transpersonal visionary experience, we are trapped in our egoic consciousness. And it's only by having a transpersonal unitive experience, visionary experience, that we recognize that there's more to the cosmos than we can, you know, understand from our egoic level. And then we feel that we can ready to take responsibility for the group or for the collective. So those are some of the ideas. I can leave it there. I really hope you'll check out the course. It's regenerativefuture.net. It starts June 29th. It'll be 8 live sessions. We have a bunch of amazing special guests, including Bruce Parry, who was the host of BBC show Tribe. My friend George Lamb, also a former TV host, who's now doing a program called Grow with inner city kids in London. My friend Sarah Wu, who's a master herbalist and permaculturist, who's built communities in Costa Rica. Yeah, it's a great assortment. Darren Springer, who works on the subject of African shamanism. And I think you guys would all really, you know, want to be part of it and check it out. We have, you know, we have scholarships and discounts. And okay, I see Jim has popped back up. So I will end there. Thank you so much. It was great to be here and appreciate it.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much. I applaud your course. You know, send your material in. We'll put it up on our events page and do what we can to promote it. I just would make one quick comment before passing it on to Margaret. And that is your reference to initiation and shamanism. I can't think of 2 more important categories. And I think it's probably worth, for those of you who may not be familiar with the kind of the connotation or the term shamanism, to just reference what Mircea Eliade, the great 20th century specialist on shamanism, the way he defined it. He said that the shaman is that person in the tribe, in the community, that speaks both the language of nature and the language of society. So the shaman is the bridge person who ensures that society stays in alignment with what nature mandates, and also translates back to society what nature wants to communicate. And, when Daniel talks about the unity of consciousness, let us hold that that consciousness is in every bird, every fish, every tree, every flower, every drop of water is infused with consciousness. And in fact, scientific studies show that all the other species engage in intelligible communication with each other. The only species who's out of that loop is the human. So when we think about regenerating the world in this pandemic, I think, Daniel, you're making some fundamentally important points, because we think technology, civic renewal, stopping the methane escaping from Siberia, and well, we should. Yesterday marked the highest temperature ever recorded in the Arctic, 101 degrees Fahrenheit. At the Arctic, 101 degrees Fahrenheit. It's about 30 degrees centigrade. So we have to do all that. But we won't be able to do all that unless we reconnect with the natural order in a shamanistic way. And, maybe this whole pandemic is one big transnational initiation, if we were up in our awareness to seizing the crisis as an opportunity for a global initiation into a shamanic mode of being. Just think of the energy that we would bring, to the point that Richard made earlier. The solutions are lying all around us. What we lack is the political will. And that requires such a fundamental shift of consciousness that Daniel's pointing to. So Daniel, hats off to you. We'll do everything we can to support and promote your Regenerating the Future workshop. So just let us know how we can be supportive. And we'll circle back during the discussion, I'm sure. I'd like to now turn to the director of an organization called the Climate Emergency, which I think speaks to itself and says just about all we need to know about Margaret Solomon. So Margaret, I want to welcome you to the program and give the floor over to you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. So I am a clinical psychologist by training. And then because of my own, let's say, personal freak out about the climate emergency, I founded 5 years ago, I founded an organization called the Climate Mobilization, and then which advocates a World War II scale response to the climate emergency. And our major campaign was these, our most successful campaign has been these climate emergency declarations. More than 1,500 governments globally, mainly local, but some higher levels of government have declared a climate emergency. And in some cases that has been mainly, let's say just talk, but in many cases, it has been a meaningful way for the government and local organizations like the Green Party, Extinction Rebellion, the Climate Mobilization, whatever, to come together to kind of reassess, okay, this is a climate emergency. What is our approach going to be? And then my book, I just published a book 2 months ago, is called Facing the Climate Emergency, How to Transform Yourself with Climate Truth. And the book really brings together these two areas of my life, which is the again, clinical psychology with this kind of social movement, climate emergency focus. And it's a self-help book. In fact, I believe it's the first self-help book of this kind, which is to help readers reckon with the truth of the climate emergency, process their fear, grief, and other painful feelings, and then critically turn that pain into effective action. So it's like I've been noticing in this conversation today, I think we have a pretty good deal of agreement on problems. I think we have a pretty good amount of agreement in terms of where we need to go, a regenerative culture, negative emissions, right? Less than zero emissions, biodiversity coming back, no extreme poverty or extreme wealth. I mean, I think probably that's a vision that needs to be developed more, but there's a lot of things that we could all agree on. But the book is to help kind of bridge the space, which can seem vast, between, okay, I'm seeing what's going on and I have some idea of where the world needs to be, but I'm just one person. What can I do? What is my role? The question, what can I do, is the single most asked question from people who work in the climate space. And it's really complicated. Figuring out what you're going to do in the climate emergency movement is, or whatever you want to call it, the movement to create a regenerative culture at emergency speed, is as complicated and personal as really choosing a career. That this is a very specific thing, right? Like, I mean, for example, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I try to help people with their emotions around the climate emergency. So, okay, so I'd like to take you, my book has 5 steps to go through this process, and I'd like to discuss each of them briefly. So step 1 is to face climate truth. I don't think we need to spend too much time on this call because of what I've heard already. People understand that this economy, this society that we have now, is on a collision course, that we're putting our food system at risk, which will cause failed states and chaos, and I mean, really everything is on the line, and that it's very soon, not in some kind of far off future for our grandchildren. So once you face the reality of how absolutely terrible this situation is, the next step is to process your fear, grief, and other painful feelings. And this is perhaps more difficult than it sounds. Our society is not one that's really helped people prepare for dealing with their feelings. We don't really learn how to do this. And I recommend to everyone to non-judgmentally welcome and explore all of your feelings, not censoring them and trying to kind of control them and only think the good ones or feel good things, right? So if you feel rage, terror, grief, whatever, all of it, despair, all of it is fine and appropriate and healthy, and they're just feelings, right? The only thing that has a moral weight that we need to really focus on is our actions. Feelings are just information. They're our body, part of us communicating with another part of us. And we should listen to them and explore them, but again, not judge or censor. So I do want to talk briefly about fear and grief in particular, because they're so important and so misunderstood in the climate emergency space. There has been, for like 30 years, there has been a terrible idea in the climate movement that fear doesn't work as a motivator. And we need to only tell a positive and optimistic story that won't kind of upset anyone. And I view this idea about fear as perhaps one of the worst ideas in the entire world, because fear is the most basic human motivator, and for other animals. Fear is literally the self-protective mechanism that allows us to translate the perception of a danger or a risk into self-protective action, right? If we didn't feel fear, we wouldn't be here, because our ancestors would have just stood quietly and, mellow while a predator got closer and closer and closer to them, right? Fear is, it's sending you an important signal. It's saying things are not okay and you need to act. So the idea that the climate movement has been telling itself and us for decades that somehow we shouldn't use fear to protect ourselves is, I just think deeply wrong and counterproductive. Then there's grief. Obviously, we should, and we do grieve for all of the people and species that are lost already due to the climate and ecological emergency. But we also need to grieve the future that the future that you thought you had, right? So for me, I saw my future. I was going to have a career in clinical psychology and have a family and, whatever, write books about psychology. And it was going to be great. I had this beautiful trajectory all planned. But through confronting the reality of the climate emergency, I realized that my best laid plans were not going to happen. That sure, I could practice for a few years and build, try to build like a little bubble within the chaos. And yeah, for a few years, whatever, maybe a decade. But I realized it wouldn't be satisfying if I was trying to do that while civilization was collapsing all around me. And this is really about, this type of grief is really about recognizing our interconnectedness, right? Because realizing, that we're all in this together. If the ship sinks, I sink, right? So you can't have your own, career plans, retirement plans, family plans that are somehow separate from the fact that we're facing a global catastrophe. So when you do that, when you grieve the future that you thought you had, it opens up space for something new. And that is step 3 is reimagine your life story. So I challenge people to think, what if everything in my life, all of the challenges, all of the blessings and education, what if that was all actually leading up to this crisis? What if this is why I am here, to help protect humanity and the living world? And so through that paradigm, through that lens of thinking about your life, you can create a story of self in which this mission is central. This is why I'm here. This is my job, my role. So step 4 is understanding and entering emergency mode. This is a type of functioning that individuals or groups can enter when it is understood that we are in danger and we need to take action right now to protect ourselves. And when you're in that emergency mode, things really change, right? You can imagine if your house is on fire, your focus changes, your priorities change, and your actions change, your allocation of resources change. This is the same when a whole country or group enters emergency mode, like the United States did during World War II, as Daniel was talking about. That is the best example, and that's why the climate mobilization really uses that example, because it is the last time it's the last time our country really did this and said, okay, there is an existential threat that everything is on the line. If we lose this war, and are occupied by the Germans or something, like if we lose this war, nothing else matters. All of our secondary goals are really firmly under this one. And therefore, we're going to have to make drastic, rapid changes, and people are going to have to, be flexible. And so, for example, banning the sale of all new consumer automobiles so that the auto industry would produce tanks, planes, ships. For example, rationing gasoline, tires, sugar, meat, so that everyone got a fair share, but supplies were limited. So when the whole country enters emergency mode, like during World War II, the whole spectrum of what is possible completely changes, utterly. All these, I get so frustrated with different kind of reporting or arguments in terms of what's possible for decarbonization, like in terms of timelines, that any arguments that say, oh no, that's not possible to reach zero emissions in 10 years, for example, it's always, well, what are your assumptions? If the government is really aggressively intervening and investing massively in order to scale up renewables and implement regenerative agriculture everywhere and ecosystem restoration, for example, then it's still impossible, or those calculations are made with a set of assumptions about how the economy and markets have to be like unfettered. Okay, so but in emergency mode, much more is possible. So finally, step 5 of facing the climate emergency is join the climate emergency movement. And in this chapter, I really try to help people think through what the movement is and what it needs, and where you can bring your special talents and skills and resources and networks. So, for example, like I said, everyone has a different role, and you have to find your, let's say, niche. But let's not be too precious about it. The way that you find that is by getting started and growing into it. So joining an organization like Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement, the school strikes, the climate mobilization, local organizations that understand the scale of the climate emergency, supporting candidates that understand the scale of the climate emergency, are all great ways to get involved. Or consider running for office yourself, even. And then the other thing beyond joining the movement that I recommend every single person do is talk about the climate emergency. Talk about it, like don't shut up about it. Talk about it with friends, family, neighbors, grocery store interactions, right? Everybody. Americans are so much more concerned, and I believe this pattern is in other countries as well. Americans are so much more concerned about the climate emergency than they talk about it. It's what Yale calls the spiral of silence. And what's amazing, and that's terrible. Spiral of silence is terrible. But what's good about it is how empowering it is. Every one of us can intervene just by talking about the climate emergency in that spiral of silence and help create the collective awakening that we need. Jim?
Thank you so much, Margaret. Boy, a lot of things spring to mind. As you probably know, what you're proposing in your 5 steps is very similar to what Joanna Macy back in the 1980s and 90s proposed for the nuclear weapons threat. And that we go through the stages of grief. And it's essential that we come to terms with our grief and our fear, and that we break through the spiral of silence, which you would call our denial.
Absolutely. I love her work.
We're willing to do that, as you're saying. Will we start to come alive to the realities that are really confronting us in the world and take action. It's like T.S. Eliot says, you know, humankind cannot bear very much reality. And we have this remarkable capacity to just block off reality as it really is and enter into some dream state where it ain't so. And so I really want to applaud your work because it's bringing back into the current reality a very important psycho-emotional process that is essential for us to undergo. And I'd like to make just one other comment before moving on to Mouctar, and that is that your final points were around essentially that once you understand this is an emergency, you act completely differently. And it's not until you recognize that we're in emergency, like in the Second World War, that you mobilize sufficiently. And it's worth just noting that part of the story. Up until the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 7th, 1941, the United States was asleep.
Absolutely.
They didn't want to know about Hitler. They didn't want to know about the persecution of the Jews. They didn't want to know that there was an invasion going on and that Hitler was going to take over. They just did not want to know. And the situation unfolded in September 1939. Hitler invaded Poland and within a matter of months had taken over most of Western Europe. And still, the Senate, the House, the population of the United States stayed in denial. It wasn't until the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, a full year and a half after the initial Nazi invasions, that President Roosevelt was able to find a way to kind of wake people up. And what he did, which is just worth just a few little details here, because what Margaret's saying, everyone, is really true. It's not until you understand that there's an emergency and you break through the denial and you enter into the fear and the grief and the sorrow and the pain and the anguish, and you come out the other side ready to do something. It's like Martin Luther King said, it's not until you're willing to die that you actually begin to be able to live. But there's a famous story of Roosevelt calling the CEOs of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler into his office and said, we've got to retool. And I want you to stop making cars and start making tanks and everything that we need to be able to fight a two-front war. And that's an important notion. The United States was the first country, I think, in the world to fight a two-front war across two oceans simultaneously. It was thought to be impossible. And that was the biggest misassumption of both the Germans and the Japanese, who had conspired that this happened. They said the United States can't pull it off. Well, they did. And the chief executives of these three big auto companies said to Roosevelt, "Oh yeah, we can retool, and we'll probably get it maybe in the next 2 years." He says, "No, you don't understand. You got to do it in the next 6 weeks." And they did. And when all was said and done, the mobilization of the people of the United States who woke up and the industrial capacity of the United States that was galvanized enabled the United States of America for the first time in an unprecedented achievement to go across two oceans fight formidable enemies, and bring them to unconditional surrender within the next 4 years. That's what Margaret's talking about. And we just saw it with the pandemic. We just think about what just happened with the pandemic. All of a sudden, as this microbe attacks humans all over the world simultaneously, shuts down the economy, all of a sudden we're engaging in social distancing, and all of a sudden we know that we're in a different reality. And the governments began to respond. It's extraordinary when they tell the history of the pandemic. We went into an emergency. Our challenge is we're in the emergency, but we haven't woken up. We have this vague sense that something's out of control, but most people want to go back to business as usual and some sense of normalcy. And it's the task of this group. It's the task of Humanity Rising. It's the task of everything all of us are doing to somehow galvanize through this crisis an awareness that will pop up in some mysterious way that will compel the public to demand of the governments that we move forward into reform rather than backwards into a deeper crisis. And so we're in that gossamer moment where we're neither fish nor fowl. There's a fissure, there's a conversation, but there's no clarity and no unanimity of will. And that means that our task is to talk about this in every way we can, as Margaret concluded. So Margaret, thank you so much. When the book comes out, let us know. We'll do everything we can to promote it. It's very important that the world wake up because we're running out of time.
Thank you. It is out. Anyone can download the first chapter for free at facingtheclimateemergency.com. I'm putting that into the chat. And I hope you all like it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Brilliant.
Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Well, listen, everyone, we'll have our final speaker now on a different topic. But it's all part of our world. And so I'd like to introduce Mouctar Ba, who is the director of the Africa Brussels Hub and has been thinking a lot about how Africa navigates through what's happening and the kind of reforms in the global system that need to be effectuated for that continent to prosper. So Mouctar, I turn the floor over to you. And then when he's done, we'll have maybe 15, 20 minutes of discussion among the panelists. Welcome, Mouctar.
Thank you very much, Jim. I will try to be very, let's say, brief, and as such, the people can also be able to have their questions answered. So, Jim, if I can summarize what I heard until now is, actually, we are currently in a situation which we call the frog and the boiling water. Meaning, if you take the frog and you put it in the boiling water, it will jump straight forward, so it won't die. But if you put the frog in the cold water and then you slowly cook the water, so the frog won't realize the danger, so it will stay in that boiling water until it dies. So we as humanity, actually, we are facing that second, issue, which means the planet is, let's say, slowly but surely, we are cooking where we are standing at this moment. So if I hear these people whom are active and the different, let's say, scientific research which we have heard here, like in the psychological part and also in microbiology and mental health, I think definitely we need to rethink what we are currently doing, we as human beings. So the paradigm shift is by default a reality. It's required. So if I can just come back to my topic for today. So my topic is all about the economy. So how our current economical system is designed, so the architecture itself. And when we say, and so maybe I will have to present myself. So I'm an economist. From my background is banking and finance. So my day-to-day job is working as an investment banker here in Belgium and also in Luxembourg. And so we are seeing on a day-to-day basis how, let's say, the world economy is actually being the source of the problems we are currently facing on a global scale. So, so when we measure, in my field of expertise, when we measure the wealth of a nation, we say the GDP per capita is actually what defines how wealthy a nation is. But today I'm here in Belgium, I'm based here in Belgium, in which we are currently facing the COVID pandemic that the whole planet is experiencing. We are on the top of what we call let's say the COVID death per capita. We are at the top of the list. So which means that's a ranking that no one wants to be, but we are currently on that level. So with all its consequences, meaning the need for paradigm shift is again emphasized. So maybe I will just start. So I'll tell you a little bit about the Brussels Africa Hub, which I'm the co-founder and the chairman. So we think, and our, let's say the idea behind our structure is, we say we need to, let's say, shift toward investment, which is sustainable and responsible. So the sustainability and the responsibility is the core of our, or the DNA of our organization. I heard from one of my, let's say the previous speakers talking a little bit about Africa, saying actually Africa could be, so the energy that the planet needs could be generated from Africa, which there are studies that also have stating similar, let's say, putting forward similar ideas. Maybe for those who don't know, today we are an electrical car business, so meaning we think we have to shift from fossil fuel toward electric cars. 2/3 of the let's say the natural resource being used for that industry, so the electrical car industry, is coming from Africa, actually, and from one country in Africa, which is called the Republic Democratic of Congo, which is located at the center of the African continent. So meaning actually Africa has a lot to give to humanity, to our planet Earth. But the question now we need to ask, which, if next to those, let's say, providing humanity with natural resources, what about the people living in that continent? So that's the whole idea of we are, which I will try to talk you through in the next couple of minutes. Therefore, I will share a screen with you. Please let me know if my screen is visible. Jim?
Yes, it works. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. So when we talk about world economic architecture, the world economic architecture actually is based on, let's say, an organization called the WTO. So that's the WTO is the World Trade Organization. So when we say, okay, so let's say, when we talk about peace, when we talk about well-being, which means that economic growth, so let's say purchasing power is required. That's a precondition. So everything that we have to do is we need to be able to afford Medicare. We need to be able to afford education. So that is a reality itself. It's a cost. There's a price linked to those what they call assets, which we all, the entire planet needs. So how can we achieve that? It's just by just like people have been, let's say my previous panelist has been saying, so we need to collaborate in order to be able to provide those basic services to humanity. So how to collaborate? So we cannot do it, let's say everyone has organized it on their own backyard. We need a global structure to just organize this properly. And the WTO was originally built to do exactly that. In 1995, when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, so in 1995, they achieved that, let's say, they managed to create this organization called WTO. But what have we seen since its creation? Actually, it didn't live by its promises. So it didn't do what we had, let's say, the creators of it had expected from it. So we see here, so if you look at the world map, so the leading economic countries is the United States and Europe, and since the beginning of the 2000s, we have China coming in. But the way that production process has been created, the way that these economies achieved their, let's say, their wealth is actually a cost to humanity itself. There's a huge cost linked to that. That's what we are currently experiencing. So let's say the global warming has its roots to the way our production process is built. So reforming that organization, it's a conditio sine qua non if we want to go forward on the path that we say we should go. Otherwise, we will end up like that frog being cooked, fully cooked, and die in that boiling water. I'm trying to move on. Just to give you a little bit how a picture on, if we today look to the world leading, let's say, economies, the trading blocks, and you won't see any African country in that picture. Why? Because the continent itself is today is completely neglected. So, and let's say the focus has been to actually to assist people while giving people the responsibility of being, let's say, responsible for their own future and just contributing to the global humanity. Today, by the absence of Africa, we can say that could be actually a cost to humanity in its whole. That's why we from the Brussels Africa Hub, we think we need definitely to embrace that paradigm shift, and just given that continent is currently virgin in terms of industrial development, we need to develop that continent using the new paradigm. That's what we are trying to tell to the people. So if, as you can see today, China and the United States, they are the leading blocks when it's come to global trade. But we cannot achieve that paradigm shift without global leadership. And for us, let's say, in our analysis, the United States, the way it's been structured, should have been the global leader in just shifting of, let's say, helping humanity to shift to the new paradigm and embracing that sustainable and responsible economic development in which all humanity could be part of it, no one being left behind, and which education and medcare should be a universal basic right for all humanity. So, and we think that's achievable, but leadership is required. The status quo, where we are currently, so the as is, it's not the way forward. We need definitely to move on to the new paradigm. Just to illustrate, as you can see today, here is what we call the monthly global economic uncertainty index. As one can see, that it has, since its inception, so with the with the current pandemic, it has shifted to a level never seen before. So, and that is worrisome for all of us, which means if we have, let's say, if humanity is about to survive, we need absolutely to embrace that paradigm shift. And that donut economy that Jim was talking about, I had the opportunity to participate in a seminar of that professor who has coined that ID. Here I'm doing my PhD on banking and finance. I did participate to that seminar, and I definitely learned a lot about that. And what he has been saying in that seminar and what Amsterdam is about to implement is exactly what we need for a sustainable society. If not, so that spike, so that economic spike, that uncertainty, that monthly global economic uncertainty index that you are seeing here on this slide is actually could result in a global conflict, which we do not want to get in. So yes, sustainability and responsibility is required, but the organizations to do so, the World Trade Organization should be on the forefront of that. If not, if everybody says we will do it on our own, then we are doomed to fail, which is a heavy cost for humanity. Jim, like I told you before, I would keep it very brief, as such people can have their questions answered. So that was my presentation on changing the global structures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mouctar. We thought it was important to include Mouctar in this discussion because oftentimes we have general conversations about climate change or infectious diseases as we have. And what Mouctar has provided for us is grounding in an area of the world where tens of millions of people are living out their lives. And so that should always be born in our reality. So I really want to thank you, Mouctar, for your contribution. I would like to now start the discussion, and we don't have very much time, unfortunately, because we only got about 10 minutes or so. But I wanted to start with Bruce Schumann, who wrote a very interesting question to Robert Bransfield, who was our initial speaker, which I think is worth just thinking about in light of current world events. Dr. Bransfield, infections cause mental impairment. Strong and interesting thesis. What about cognitive elements such as racism? Is racism an infection? What is the role of misleading ideas and ideologies? Given everything around George Floyd and the activism and protests all over the world over the last month around that, I thought that was a very powerful question. So thank you, Bruce Schumann. And Dr. Bransfield, I know you answered it in the chat box, but I thought it'd be worth just a couple of minutes of general comment to the group.
Okay. All right, I can expand on what I said in my answer. But when someone's mentally intact, they're more tolerant, they're more capable, they function on a higher level. But if they have brain injury, brain impairment, then it causes a more restricted adaptive capability. Cognitive abilities are less, emotional functioning is impaired, and mental flexibility is diminished. So when a person's more restricted like that, and they can be more rigid, then they're less tolerant of people that have opposing views or opposing lifestyles, opposing religion, opposing race, opposing ethnic background. And so the higher level functioning, a higher level functioning of individual can be more embracing of opposing views, incorporate that and adapt. But you do see, and I think this exists in history, that when you see lower level functioning, then you see more threat of anyone who's different in some way or another. Tribal differences are greater. And we can see that throughout the world. We can see it throughout history, that with conflict zones, and that's a part of conflict zones, whether it be racial or some other type of conflict. So I think that higher level of functioning, and it goes back to that point that I made of that when they look at the different countries and look at mental functioning and IQ, the countries with the lower infection load had higher in functioning and a higher level of peace. And the countries with the higher infection load had lower level of functioning and a higher level of violence. And to understand how violence works, in the brain, there's opposing forces. So there's attack and restrain, and they're both in balance. So there's a part of me that says, I don't like what you say, attack, but restrain, gee, I have a bond to you and that holds me back. And there's many different levels at how this occurs if we look at how violence and aggression happens. But a very intact person has greater capability to sort it through and deal with that more effectively. Whereas a person who's more impaired, they have less restraint, they have less of the higher powers, and they may be more of a knee-jerk reflex to just react to something that disagrees with their belief system. And you do see more of this intolerance, whatever the issue may be, whether it's racial or otherwise.
Amazing perspective. Thank you for that. It's well worth contemplating that that general health is more than just the importance to the individual. It's important for the whole society. And I think it's worth also noting, as you stated it originally, and I think Richard as well, the countries that have come through the pandemic the most successfully have the highest general health of their population. I've been in Holland, for example. They have a very strong medical infrastructure. They actively work to support healthy people. And predictably, the pandemic had some effect here, but it was very low. And so that's an extremely important point. I wanted to ask you, Daniel, and Richard, and Margaret, and Mouctar, let's start with you, Mouctar, since the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And just take 30 seconds, just a short statement around the question, given this conversation, given the state of the world, given the crisis and the opportunity in which we find ourselves, what's your advice? What's final word would you like to make to the audience that would empower them in some way? Mouctar?
Thank you, Jim. It's a very good question, to be honest with you. And my, let's say, opinion is we are, let's say, part of a system, which is a very complex system. And the way we consume, so because we drive the whole, let's say, overconsumption, we as individuals. So we need to take responsibility in that. So when we talk about the global warming, which means, okay, it's the way we behave, it has a direct impact on the planet. So if we responsibilize ourselves and make sure that what we do, we take into account of, okay, what could be the consequences of that? That could be a very interesting to do some self-introspection, I think. It's in the best interest, instead of waiting the others telling us or a higher level government telling us, I think it should be we telling ourselves
Exactly.
what's good, what's bad for us.
Great.
That's
Thank you. Thank you. And that's at the heart of donut economics. This interface
absolutely.
between my well-being, my city's well-being, my community's well-being, and planetary constraints. What's the effect out there in the larger eco field? So thank you, Mouctar, and good luck with reforming the WTO. That's a tall order, brother. It'll take a man as of your stature to pull it off. So thank you. Margaret,
Thank you very much, Jim, for having me.
your final word for today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And what I would say is no one is coming to save us, which is very frightening, but it should also be inspiring, because we are all called in this moment to become the leaders that we need, the leaders that are missing. So I really do encourage everyone to consider taking responsibility for solving the climate emergency. Just saying the apocalypse will not unfold on my watch. And while I realize no one can do this alone, and in some ways taking responsibility for this huge global emergency is kind of maybe asking too much. On the other hand, I think in another sense, it's the only sane and rational and responsible reaction given the extremity of this situation. So I say, go all in, take responsibility, and refer to my book for more specific guidance in how to do that. So thanks again.
Thank you. Carpe diem, seize the day. That's the bottom line, I think. So thank you so much, Margaret. I appreciate it. I think that Daniel Pinchbeck had to leave for another appointment, so he's no longer with us. So we'll move to you, Richard.
There we are. So yeah, so what I would say, and thank you, Jim, by the way, this was really inspiring. I'm so happy I got to meet all the other speakers. And look, I agree with Margaret on it. I mean, the 3 points that I had suggested is first, proper motivation. I've been trained by Buddhist masters for the past 40 years. And their take is nothing happens without the first proper motivation, which is, as Margaret was saying, you want to believe that you are going to become a savior of the world. You can't know how you're going to start. But if you just have the motivation that I want to help everyone, I want to make a difference in the world, you expand your heart and your mind in love and compassion. The fact is that things actually happen. And the PowerPoint that I gave on this 3-part program of transforming personal health comes after 30 years of looking at chronic diseases, not just Lyme and tick-borne, but looking at how infections and toxins and multiple sources of inflammation are driving chronic disease. And they're both outlined in my 2 books, Why Can't I Get Better and How Can I Get Better? But the last part of it, specifically about planetary health, I was surprised when I started looking at this years ago that there are scientific solutions. It's not a question that we don't have the solutions. We just need the political will. So it's now about all of us speaking up, speaking to your representatives, writing to whoever the powers that be, speaking to people around you. It's about raising awareness, talking about it, but recognizing we do have solutions, and we just need to come together at this point. And it is humanity's greatest challenge, but I think we're up for it. I mean, we've got some brilliant people now working on it.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're saying, what Margaret's saying, Mouctar, is basically proceed until apprehended. We've come to the moment, everyone, where we, as Mouctar said, you can't just wait for your governments to tell you what you're supposed to do. We know what we're supposed to do. We're just not doing it in sufficient numbers to create a critical mass to turn the tide. So, Richard, I think this is right. If you've got anything that we can put up on our UBverse, any blogs, any articles, anything to empower people, this is what Humanity Rising is all about. We've got to wake up, we've got to act, and we've got to change the world as the goal of our action. That's the bottom line. So thank you so much. Thank you.
My pleasure.
And Robert, what's your final word for folks?
I guess we want to do everything we can, but we have to realize our limitations. There's a theory hypothesis that the variations in climate are certainly we impact it, but there's some of it that's outside our control. And one hypothesis has to do with the rotation of the Earth around the sun, that there's fluctuations involving Jupiter or other bodies in our solar system. So there is this cycle of climate change that's a part of the history of the Earth, even before people were here, and even after we're gone, that will probably happen. But there is that part that we can impact. And we want to do what we can to make it viable. And we always have to think of a balanced ecosystem and how things impact one another. And I think, it's good that you're doing this. It's good you're bringing people together. And I'd like to see this cooperative effort continue. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Robert. And we just this last Sunday, we had a presentation by the Director of Research of the Heart Math Institute, and he laid out a graph of the sun flares.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a direct relationship between levels of violence, wars, aggression, with the apogee moments of sun flares. Mm-hmm. It's also a time where human creativity, human genius gets activated in an extraordinary way. And it's worth just noting that, because not only are we influenced by the smallest little microbes and viruses and bacteria, as we've just seen through the pandemic, we're also influenced by the macro, by the emanations coming out of our sun, the different planetary alignments, the moon causing the rise and fall of the tides. There's all kinds of influences that are permeating our realities. And one of the things that we talked about was the way that if you just center your attention on your heart and you quiet your heart into the rhythm, the heart will start to beat in alignment with the pulsations, the electromagnetic pulsations of the earth. So we're all in one thing. And it's our illusion of separateness that is at the root, in my view, of our current predicament. And this panel has really gone to some very deep issues that I think all of us need to ponder very, very carefully. Issues having to do with how our mental states are affected by our general health. Issues related to the climate change and the climate emergency that we're in, the need for deeper understandings of initiation, a return to the shamanic way of being in the world, so that we're communicating with nature as much as we're communicating amongst ourselves. Human beings have been cut off from the larger conversation going on in the larger ecology. And somehow we have to relearn the language of nature. And that's what the shamans did from time immemorial. How do we regain that capacity? Not to just commune with nature, but to intelligibly communicate with nature. And as Margaret was pointing out, how do we understand that our deeper emotions of fear and grief are emotions with which we have to be in touch. We have to let them inform us and thereby activate our higher energies and our highest potential. And then as Mouctar shared, it all comes down to how we change lives on the ground in places like Africa that have been ravaged by climate change and somehow need to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, but with the help of international institutions. So how do you reform our international institutions so they align, for example, with donut economics? Just imagine if the World Trade Organization, which monitors trade, that's its job, was in the service of the earth and the ecosystems rather than the rapacious capital intensive motivated corporations. Just think of how the world would change if one major international institution would embrace human well-being as its goal, not the accumulation of capital, and would begin a process of attuning the development of human well-being within the context of biomimicry of natural systems. It would change the world. It doesn't take much. And that's why we have to proceed until apprehended. If all of us would do the right thing and just simply proceed until apprehended, and at the point when someone tells us no, well, we'll sit down and negotiate. But until then, we're doing what's necessary to save civilization and save this earth. So I really want to thank the panel. Thank you so much. Tomorrow we're going to look more at this issue of global governance. How can the world come together as a singular system? That's a powerful thought. And we're going to have a panel that will guide that discussion tomorrow. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you same time, 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock p.m. Central European time here on Zoom and live streamed on Facebook and Awake TV and all our multiple partner channels. So thank you. See you tomorrow.